Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Tensions on the Korean Peninsula are once again in focus after North Korea carried out a series of missile launches in recent days. South Korea's military says Pyongyang fired several short-range ballistic missiles this morning after earlier launches since Monday. The launches come just days after Kim Yo-jong called President Lee Jae Myung's expression of regret over the incidents of the South Korean drones being flown across the border a wise decision. She said Kim Jong-un viewed Lee's remarks as honest and magnanimous. Seoul initially viewed that exchange as a possible sign of easing tensions, but with North Korea now carrying out multiple launches, the situation appears far more uncertain. So what message is Pyongyang sending, and how could these developments shape security on the Korean Peninsula? To discuss this, we are joined by Dr. Stephen Norfer, President of Asia Dialogue. A very big welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be back.
And also joining us is Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. Good to see you, Professor Kelly.
Hi, thank you for having me again.
So let's start the discussion right away. Of course, with the latest news, North Korea, it has carried out several launches over the past 2 days, including short-range ballistic missile launches this morning. Now, this came after Kim Yo-jong called President Lee Jae Myung's expression of regret over the drone incident a very fortunate and wise decision. How should we interpret this timing of the launches, Professor Kelly?
Yeah, it's unfortunate the North Koreans did this at the same time because I think there was some hope for some space to sort of move things forward. But I think, to be honest, that the North Korean missile program probably marches to its own tune, which is to say that when the scientists believe, when the engineers believe that the missiles need to be tested, these things happen. And, perhaps if there's some particular moment, maybe some South Korean politicians said something particularly opportune, those things can be delayed, right? But, North Korea is really dependent on its missile force for protection, right? The rest of the North Korean military isn't particularly capable, at least vis-a-vis the South Korean military, right? Missiles are really central, particularly short-range missiles upon which the North Koreans would probably put small nuclear weapons for use against South Korea. So this kind of testing, I think, is just sort of built in. I think it's really kind of baked in right now, and North Korea's really doubled down on missiles and on nuclear weapons in the last, 10, 20 years. And so the timing is, again, I think inopportune, but I'm not sure we should read too much into it other than, I think what we already know, which is that North Korea is sort of marching towards the demilitarization and nuclearization of its force. I think the South Korean government was kind of hoping for some space and wants to talk to North Korea about it, but it just doesn't look like Kim Jong-un has responded to the outreach of this administration, at least this year.
So it's really still too early to jump into conclusions, right? Now, when we follow up on that, South Korea's Unification Ministry described Kim Yo-jong's remarks as a positive signal for improving inter-Korean relations. But like I've said, North Korea carrying out these launches for 2 consecutive days. Dr. Norber, how could this affect tensions on the Korean Peninsula right now?
Well, certainly there's a rise in tensions. However, I think we need to keep this in perspective. I think as Professor Kelly was indicating, there's sort of a calibration, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, in the sense that the North Koreans are perfecting their technology, and there is a separate agenda for the missile program and those refinements. But at the same time, the response of Kim Yo-jong and the statements that were attributed to Kim Jong-un are quite important because they show at least an acknowledgement. They referred to President Yi as president, and they are continuing to push their 2-state reality, right, having backed off of the unification priority. And so all of that sort of fits into that, guys. There are other factors as well we should consider. One thing to keep in mind is that Iran has shown its own capabilities with missiles of late that may have emboldened the DPRK, especially with the disposition of U.S. assets, the THAAD system out of Korea, the deployment of troops from Okinawa toward the Middle East. And with that space, the DPRK may find that the timing is right to do some of these refinements as America is distracted in the Gulf and with the Iran focus. And so I think that heavily conditions the opportunity for them to begin to test and to continue to make those refinements. So we need to take some of it in stride, and our concern is very real, but at the same time, this isn't to be unexpected. And perhaps not mutually exclusive of the positive comments that Kim Yo-jong and those attributed to Kim Jong-un that were offered were made. And though we've heard some negative statement out of Pyongyang today relative to the bureaucracy, again, that's the give and take that happens. And at least there was a somewhat positive notion here at play over the last 2 days relative to the apology and relative to DPRK acknowledgement of that. So that's worthwhile mentioning and underscoring.
So there are definitely a lot of factors to weigh in, including the situation in the Middle East. Now, when we speak of that, when we turn to Washington, President Donald Trump complained that the U.S. did not receive enough support from its allies in the war with Iran, and he specifically pointed out to South Korea. Professor Kelly, why do you think President Trump keeps bringing up South Korea?
They sort of lumped South Korea in with Australia and Japan and the rest. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration did not expect the war in Iran to go the way that it did. They didn't really plan around the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Navy was very concerned about sailing in force into the strait because it's so narrow and be vulnerable to mines and drones and missiles and so on, right? I mean, there's nothing really that any allied navy could do in the strait that the U.S. Navy couldn't. I think what Trump was really trying to do was sort of blame shift and sort of pull others in so you could sort of apportion the negative outcome, the war, right? So we could sort of blame others for not doing more and stuff like that. And that's kind of Trump's way, right? I mean, Trump doesn't really take responsibility when he makes mistakes. And we saw this during COVID, for example, when he said, I take no responsibility at all. I mean, this is sort of old hat from him. And then I'm not sure that South Korea was singled out particularly. I mean, the comments that he made about South Korea were all wrong. I actually sort of wrote a thread on Twitter about that. You got the numbers of U.S. soldiers here wrong. And I mean, Trump doesn't really sort of fully understand. He doesn't know too much about the American commitment here. But I mean, he's made those kinds of mistakes. He said all kinds of crazy stuff about NATO too. So I would sort of put those comments in with sort of Trump's general disdain for U.S. allies, the sort of belief that U.S. allies owe the United States a great deal of money, that they don't really exist without American security, and that therefore they should be sort of on beck and call for America when it gets into trouble. And I think that's what Trump was really sort of responding to, right? He's kind of high on American power. He's sort of intoxicated, I think, by the success of the Venezuela operation, particularly, and thought Iran would be easy. And then when it didn't work out, he kind of tried to buck pass or blame shift. And I think South Korea's response was sort of similar to what you've heard from all the other American allies, which, if you told us, you give us some time to work something up, maybe we could have worked on this project, right? But South Korea, like many U.S. allies, doesn't have a blue water navy that can just sort of sail halfway around the world to fix Donald Trump's mess. And I think that's really what happened here, right? And my guess is that Trump will sort of move on and not really single out South Korea again in the future, right? As long as Trump is distracted by the Middle East, my sense is that South Korea is just one more U.S. ally he can blame when things don't go well. It's kind of a useful whipping boy or whatever for Trump's errors and mistakes. I think the real concern, if I were South Korean, what I'd really be worried about is if Donald Trump actually starts to focus his diplomatic and foreign policy attention on East Asia, and then he sort of raises the pressure by insisting that Japan and South Korea and so on do all kinds of new things. And he starts pressuring them the way he has European allies, say, over Canada and Greenland. So far, Trump has not done that because I think he's been distracted by Russia and Iran. But if he ever turns his attention to Asia, I would imagine that his language on South Korea will become significantly harsher.
So as for now, he's quite focused on the situation in the Middle East. But President Trump, he also criticized the previous administration's North Korea's policy, saying it allowed North Korea to become a nuclear state. And some say this sounded like he was acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear power. Dr. Norber, how do you see it?
Well, that has been somewhat implicit in many of Donald Trump's comments. I don't think most analysts believe that he has a great deal of concern. He feels he has a personal relationship with Kim Jong-un that may lead to a meeting, perhaps in the wake of his meeting with Chinese President Xi, maybe in the months after. The Trump administration has very much signaled a desire to meet with Pyongyang. So he relies on that personal relationship. And to that extent, he really doesn't give a full credence elsewhere. And his ultimate concern may not really be denuclearization, even though that's a stated U.S. and an international goal. He sees that perhaps in the longer term, or that's what his advisors recommend. And they're much more interested in something happening in the shorter term, perhaps from Trump's perspective, much more transactional, much more economic cooperation oriented. And that may well fit into Kim Jong-un's ultimate goal here. And so perhaps in that sense, odd as it sounds, they may align in ways that still, though, warrant the concern of the international community relative to ultimately the denuclearization goal, the dream of a nuclear weapons-free Korean Peninsula. But certainly the direction now looks the other way. And we see that in terms of Iran's full display of its missile capabilities and what it was developing by way of nuclear capability. The DPRK is far beyond where Iran was. And this will only reinforce in Pyongyang's mind that after things like Libya and Iraq, and now Iran, with which they enjoyed a much closer relationship, that their program of nuclear development is one that is warranted. And so that's something we should be concerned about, concerned in terms of the nonproliferation regime and concerned about an arms race increasing in Northeast Asia.
Concerning developments indeed. But when we shift our focus to domestic affairs inside North Korea, Kim Jong-un, he carried out 25 public activities in March, one of the highest monthly totals since he came to power. Professor Kelly, how should we interpret this unusually high level of activity from Kim?
Yeah, it seems like the government of North Korea is making, like the Kim family, is making a sort of big effort to promote the daughter as the next ruler, right? This is something the National Intelligence Service in South Korea seems to be tilting towards, and the analyst community seems to be tilting in that direction too. I think generally the idea that this Kim, is out among the population and talking to people and shaking hands, like here in your video, and he's sort of going to pools and things like the farms and stuff like that. I think part of that is to kind of counteract the impression that you had under his father, Kim Jong-il, who was didn't really like going out in public, didn't like speaking in public, and he kind of North Korea was kind of adrift. Then you had the famine and stuff like that. And so I think part of it, as you're seeing here in the videos, is that Kim Jong-un wants to look, he's out there, he cares about people, he cares about how North Korea is doing and so on and stuff like that. It's part of the kind of charm offensive to make it look like he actually is engaged in the population's welfare. But I think the more specific run-up of activities that you're referencing in the last, 6 months or so, here you see the daughter, right, is sort of to promote Yue as the successor. I think that's going to be a real tricky issue in North Korea because North Korea is fairly traditional in terms of its understandings of gender and sexual morality and stuff like that. Promoting a female dictator in North Korea is going to be tough. I think it's going to be a difficult sell. Promoting a Kim is not particularly difficult. I think the real issue is promoting a woman in a society that is highly gendered and highly patriarchal. And it's just not clear if he can do that. It's probably going to take a while. It'll take longer for him to groom her than he was groomed by his father. That process only lasted about 3 or 4 years. So, Kim is I think he's like 43 or something like that. He's fairly overweight and he doesn't lead a particularly healthy lifestyle. So he might be trying to sort of lay the groundwork for her promotion because, he's kind of getting older and he's got some health issues and stuff like that. And she probably needs more time to get sort of smoothed into the back rooms of Pyongyang, the various elites in the military and so on that run the place. And that's going to take some time. Again, just my guess is solely because of the gender issue. I'm actually quite skeptical that she will be accepted in North Korea. And if that's going to happen, it's going to take time. And so my sense is we're going to see this kind of stuff. If she is indeed the successor for NIS, it's going to take some time. He's going to have to work on this for 5 or 10 years. He can't just drop her on the North Korean elite the way he was in early 2011 when Kim Jong-il was so ill.
Right. So it could really be seen as some efforts to, push through with his succession plan. But North Korean media has also intensified propaganda praising Kim Jong-un himself as a very hardworking leader. Dr. Norbert, does this suggest his personal leadership system is becoming more entrenched right now?
Well, that has been really effectively consolidated over the course of the last decade plus now. And, Kim Jong-un proceeded through the regency status to consolidating his position from early notions of military and economic development. And now he fancies himself a more sophisticated leader. Again, as he approaches his mid-40s, his trip for the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II to Beijing, where he walked astride Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin. And so now he is trying to emphasize the idea of his daughter, dynastic succession. But really, the idea is to keep it in the family, right? A Confucian dynasty as much as a communist one. And that's very important in terms of the way that he sees the consolidation of things. Regime security is his top priority and keeping that in the family. And so I think we need to look at it through those prisms. We don't need to overstate, I think in particular, her role. She clearly plays a key role for him. He, in doing this, is portraying himself as a loving father, as he does to the people. He's really trying to pick up much more the message of his grandfather, sort of a populist president. He tries to put himself in as young, more sophisticated, sort of hip to the world that's evolving. And clearly all of that is designed to give him legitimacy in the eyes of his people and to maintain control. And so in that sense, his strategy has worked fairly well and has seemingly endeared him to the people, at least more than, as Professor Kelly indicates, his father, who was much more aloof, much more remote. So look at it in that vein, and I think we see a natural progression here along the lines of Confucian dynasty.
But if we turn to some of the military aspect, North Korea, it also revealed the new solid fuel engine tests and signs of more advanced ICBM technology as well. Dr. Norberg, what kind of challenges could this development pose for future nuclear talks or deterrence?
Well, they are clearly moving into the area of technological sophistication, refinements. They've been wanting miniaturization. They've been wanting enhanced guidance systems. We don't know what Russia is providing in return for DPRK troops and KN-23 missiles, on the Ukraine front. We do know that relationship has tightened. Probably it's helped in terms of some of the technological refinements. And so the DPRK is pushing ahead. What it does remind us is the necessity to get to the negotiating table, a negotiating table that includes the ROK and the United States and perhaps other multilateral partners, Japan and others, and that it's important to consider possibilities using the good offices of the United Nations and trying to get some sort of discussion going here. Because as we're seeing with the Iran situation, things can escalate very rapidly. And that is always the concern with the Korean Peninsula. And it augurs for an approach that is more sophisticated, more inclusive. And that seems to be what the pragmatism and the patience of President Yi is emphasizing, that this thing will happen, with thoughtfulness and progress. It seems to be the orientation of the international community. And so trying to get the DPRK to the table is a top priority. And we'll see what the trade-offs are, but perhaps there will be a sit down between Trump and Kim. And if not, we'll look at the context of the DPRK and its relations. We've mentioned Iran, but certainly its relations with states like Russia and with Belarus, and its different alignments on the international stage, and perhaps some of those countries providing a convenient setting for mediation and dialogue.
Right. So it really circles back to the necessity of negotiations there. Now,
absolutely.
Well, finally, when we look ahead, some observers say next month's Victory Day celebration in Russia, it could bring a meeting between the leaders of North Korea, Russia, and Belarus. And if that happens, what kind of implications could that have for the Korean Peninsula and the global security, Professor Kelly?
Sure. So I think one of the reasons why North Korea doesn't really feel like it needs to talk to South Korea anymore is because it's got a new patron. The Russians are in trouble in Ukraine, which means the North Koreans can squeeze them for certain technologies, for certain assistance and stuff like that. There's some rumor, for example, that Russian banks should replace Chinese banks as the place where the North Koreans are sticking their illegal monies. We know that the North Koreans use a lot of the same weapon systems as the Russians, particularly in artillery, right? Because the North Korean military is basically based on the Red Army of yore. And so the North Koreans are able to export a lot of ammunition to the Russians, even if it doesn't seem to work particularly well. The point is that the North Koreans have provided a lot of at least the ammo that's been used in the last 18 months or so. And there are other valuable things, North Korean mercenaries and so on, right? I mean, this relationship is now probably about 2 years old, right? And so that gives that gives the North Koreans some space to push back on Chinese pressure, for example, right? The Chinese are always kind of flirting with cracking down on sanctions in order to get the North Koreans to sort of like be a little bit more, compliant, right? It means that the North Koreans don't have to talk to us, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and so on. Right. And so I would imagine that, yeah, I mean, you sort of got the photographs here going. I would imagine that you'll see that, right? That you would see Kim talking more to Russia, right? I mean, the more that the North Koreans have options, the more players they can play against one another, right? Just like they did during the Cold War when they played China and the Soviet Union against each other. The more countries locally here that sort of talk to the North Koreans, want to be involved in North Korea's economy in some way, want to be involved with the North Korean arms trade, right? The more North Korea has options and leverage and so on that it can use in its efforts to sort of stay alive in this tough neighborhood. And I think that is probably the reason why, even though you have a détente-oriented progressive government in South Korea, the North Koreans feel like they don't have to respond to it. If the Russians and the Chinese helped us more on sanctions, right? If they didn't engage North Korea so much and North Korea had fewer options outside of talking to South Korea, I think you might actually see North Korea talking to the South. But as long as the North Koreans go to the Chinese and the Russians and play them against each other, for example, right, then North Korea can sort of continue to kind of slip and slide in the crevices of international politics. And they've been doing that for decades. They're really, really good at it. And so I would imagine, sort of that's a long answer to your question, which is yes, I would imagine that Kim will go to Moscow, have these various talks and stuff like that. All of that is an effort to get gains from North Korea, but also to keep sort of North Korea from getting tied into only one partner or one or two patrons where it's really subject to the pressure of that exclusive relationship, right? The more it can talk to more countries, the more it can sort of press each for gains and play them off one another and get a good deal for itself. And the North Koreans, again, they've been doing that for decades, and I would imagine this is sort of a part of that project.
So it looks like they're really expanding their reach, and we'll have to keep close eyes on their next movements moving forward. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Dr. Norper, we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Delighted.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.